And now I have the great pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker. And may I ask Brian Iselin to start? And I know also, Brian, you're a specialist. You gave us this idea to switch from supply side to demand. So it's very good that you start this webinar. Please.
Thank you. First is always the tricky one, right? A lot of pressure. But thanks, Michelle. It's a great pleasure as always to be here to talk, in particular to talk about the demand side and to sit in the company of Inge and Valiant. So I wanted to start just by spending a little time on what I describe as exploitation creep. And then I'll help turn your thoughts to what the demand side is, some possible demand side solutions, in particular for human rights issues in workplaces and global value chains. I'm going to focus on the labor side of the question. So over the last 20 or so years, the problem of human trafficking has become, as everybody knows, a focus of government and advocacy agendas worldwide, and it has become a subject of enormous amounts of funding over the years as well. Increasingly, we talk about human trafficking of all types as modern-day slavery or modern slavery, and the phenomenon itself has prompted the rapid proliferation, let's say, of international, regional, anti-trafficking laws, agencies, and policies. And it's inspired states to devote enormous financial and bureaucratic resources to its eradication. There's barely a government in the world now that doesn't have a unit that deals with this issue. When I started talking about human trafficking back in 2000, at the time of the protocol, no government agency had trafficking people. So it's all spawned an industry of non-profits as well that have elevated the abolition of trafficking into a rather pressing moral campaign. And anyone can join in these campaigns, right? They're grassroots campaigns. Almost every country has these anti-trafficking organizations. You can join them basically at the click of a mouse. And of course, legal scholars have jumped into the fray because ever since the trafficking protocol, there's been debate in particular about how law can be marshaled and which laws, the trafficking protocol comes from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. It doesn't come from the human rights bodies. So then which laws apply? Human rights law, trade law, labor law, and if you look at the United States, even military might has been brought in to combat trafficking. But what exactly is it everyone is trying to fight? I think there's still phenomenal differences and arguments, clawing arguments, people clawing each other's eyes out about the definitions. So, and I think notwithstanding the global consensus that trafficking is something to be rid of, the anti-trafficking field is actually, even after 22 years since the protocol, it's a strikingly rigor-free zone. It's a thinking-free zone when it comes to defining the concept, measuring its extent, and arriving at solutions. And against a rigor-free background, it's unbelievable that we fund the programs the way we do in a very blinkered way, and I'll go through that right now. So during the first decade of the modern anti-trafficking regime, finding its roots in the trafficking protocol, the US was a mover and shaker and used its influence to pressure other states to establish aggressive, perpetrator-focused criminal justice responses to trafficking. That's where the protocol started. That's why it came from the UNODC and not the Human Rights Council. Dramatic changes in the anti-trafficking field since the year 2000 have led to a second generation of battles over definitions and approaches. There were wild battles between different parties in the drafting to the protocol, and we have new battles now. Prompted, I think, in many parts by the efforts of the Obama administration to promote a broader legal definition and a broader policy understanding of trafficking, which I'm in favor of. At the same time, it drew the crowds, right? There was really some discontent amongst a lot of people for this broadening of the definition. And there's been a lot of, call it discursive conflation, the aggregate effect of which is different and usually well-intentioned initiatives coming together, butting heads with each other, and has resulted in what I refer to as exploitation creep. So over time, all forced labor and increasingly all exploitative labor has been recast as trafficking. even if no one changes location at all, because you remember the original definition of trafficking in the protocol required a movement. Second, all trafficking is now widely being labelled as slavery. Exploitation creep has been expressed through efforts to expand previously rather narrow legal categories, in fact extremely narrow legal categories, at least in terms of rhetoric and policy, but also sometimes with hard law, like the modern slavery acts that are trending around the world, in a bid to subject a broader range of practices to a greater amount of public opprobrium. And I'm all for it. I think that there are, all of the things that we now call modern slavery are absolutely valid they're absolutely valid for inclusion in us responding to that and protecting people. This effort has involved, for example, breaking out of the earlier legal limitations brought about by the protocol, including the elements of movement, situations in which people are maintained or born into forced labour are included, and the legal and moral category of slavery, the prohibition of which has existed, as you know, in international law far longer than trafficking, which was previously reserved for the most extreme forms of exploitation, but has now been extended to cover all trafficked persons. So after almost 2 years of this exploitation creep, we've unintentionally infused a labour perspective into trafficking law and policy regime. So you see where I'm going with this and why I'm talking about this as a prelude to talking about forced labour. So by that I mean by expanding the reach of anti-trafficking regimes to include forced labour, and now, even in the last perhaps 6 years, other substandard labour conditions, exploitation creep has also made labour policy and the concept of labour itself explicitly relevant to a field that hitherto and through the protocol was narrowly focused actually on sexual exploitation. So from this labour perspective, trafficking needs to be understood as a product of weak labour and actually quite dreadful migration frameworks. A rising chorus of labour institutions and advocates is consequently, and mostly over the last 10 years, seeking strengthened labour protections as a means of reducing vulnerability to trafficking. So exploitation creep has helped bring the anti-trafficking community, such as it is, it's a very broken community, to a crossroads. And frankly, it's a crossroads at which we've now been stuck for the better part of these last 2 years. The last 10 years. That junction is, do we stay the course of criminal justice-focused policy like the overwhelming number of states want, or do we also pursue the structural changes that a labour approach prescribes? And the labour approach is mostly driven by NGOs and international organisations, not by states. So I would argue for the latter option, that we need to pursue the structural changes that a labour approach prescribes. Since the modern anti-trafficking regime's inception, and I've said this a dozen times in these webinars with you, Michelle, crime control-focused interventions have produced, at best, disappointing results. Even if you look at some of the better, but still hugely flawed metrics that are out there. Arguably one of the strongest regimes on anti-trafficking, the United States, sees only tens of thousands of victims. And globally, if you think about the backdrop to this, tens of thousands are a teardrop compared to the dozens of millions that another equally flawed source, the Modern Slavery Index, suggests we have out there. I think that I've said this many times, but I think we need to look at numbers around this with an incredibly big grain of salt. And what we should consider is just we're talking tens of millions, or in fact, hundreds of millions of people in conditions that are unacceptable, including child labour. So because the trafficking protocol was negotiated under the purview of the UNODC, the drafters were law enforcement officials, they're unversed in human rights standards, and they were only interested in human rights standards insofar as they served crime control goals. So I think we got exactly what we asked for, but it wasn't where it was so limited in scope. Exploitation creep was almost always going to happen, and it has. I think it's fair to say that the human rights advocates in the drafting of the protocol were pretty well caught flat-footed by the extensive focus on a crime control frame, let's say. So border control and crime control were the leading points, and human rights advocates were pretty much sidelined in many ways. So even against the backdrop of the exploitation creep, though, a slow move away from older forms of trafficking to these broader definitions, there's still something missing in our response. So while labour exploitation has been added to the agenda, the old criminal justice model prevails. So, as a metaphor, while the menu has changed quite dramatically, the way we're eating it remains the same. What is missing are demand-side interventions. Entirely missing. So, and to understand the demand side and why we should be working on the demand side, you need to first understand the causation when we're talking about labour exploitation and human trafficking, modern slavery generally. For decades, it has suited many NGOs and governments and international organizations, largely for funding purposes, to stay on this criminal justice path, because states are upholding the criminal justice path, and they're the principal funders in this field. You could actually say that thousands of organizations worldwide have benefited from this historically narrow range of eating options, and none of them want to rock that financially viable meal ticket. So you can count easily on one hand the organizations that have been swimming against that tide, easily less than one hand. So let's talk about what the problem is confronting us and where causation comes into it. And I want to start by saying that my definition of causation is the same as Friedrich Nietzsche's, which is that we're not looking, when we're trying to find cause, on the small force that propels a boat out into a river. We're looking, you have to go back beyond that to the source of the river. And this is where causation comes in. So the problem really confronting us is we need to distinguish cause from vulnerability. And this is something that has taken 21 years and still doesn't happen. I still see counter-trafficking people writing articles talking about poverty as a cause of trafficking. The causes of all forms of exploitation is the instigating existing demand for people to be exploited. We often hear there was this phrase in the early 2000s, the 3 Ds, dirty, dangerous, and degrading work. So with exploitation creep, we've actually gone beyond that to any labour that is exploitative. It's beyond dirty, dangerous, and degrading. So what is not a cause of modern slavery is a vulnerability to be enslaved. It's a logical fallacy that we believe that. It's not sexual abuse that causes modern slavery. It's not poverty. It's not unemployment, undocumented or documented migration, not inadequate laws or bad policy. These are not causes of modern slavery. The problem confronting us is someone who makes the moral and economic choice to exploit somebody else. And that right there is the essence of demand. Because if we're addressing vulnerabilities, we're arguably on what's called the supply side. If we're addressing cause, we're on the demand side. Someone makes the premeditated or an opportunistic decision to exploit someone else's labour, and in so doing denies them decent working conditions. And the person behind this decision is what we're looking at in addressing the demand side. I mentioned before that there's most of the organizations in the world, the vast, overwhelming majority of organizations, are writing a kind of a meal ticket. And more than 99% of global spending on modern slavery is spent on the supply side, because of our universal criminal justice fixation. And I come from a criminal justice background, right? I'm used to being the knee-jerk reaction. But criminal justice is a knee-jerk reaction to modern slavery. All of the modern money for modern slavery is spent either rescuing victims during the exploitation or fixing the victim up after being exploited. No money goes into addressing the structural problems behind it all, which is the demand. And I want to put out here, and Michel, please jump in if I'm going far too long, but a very useful analogy, since we all know what COVID is. For COVID-19, there are effectively 2 possible responses, right? There's treatment, which is, for example, the emergency route, and there's vaccination, which helps prevent the disease continuing and cuts the pandemic off. You can't solve the problem of COVID, a pandemic, through treatment. Important as it is to provide services to help people who are sick, it's not that you stop the emergency treatment. But you can't solve COVID that way. You are not, by treating everybody coming in, you are not making a dent in the structural problem. So you can't invest everything in emergency treatment rooms. And at the moment with trafficking, we're investing everything in emergency treatment rooms. To make a dent in the structural problem of a pandemic like COVID, we needed to vaccinate. It's a long and slow process compared to immediate treatment. It demands an investment and it demands patience to see it work. It's not immediate. It doesn't give these quick wins that government agencies so much want and donors so much demand. And so it's precisely the case with modern slavery. We're spending 99% on treatment and treating cases as they emerge, which, as I say, is important. You can't ignore it, or finding cases in the community, but we're not preventing anything. We're not changing the system. We're not changing the dynamics of what are essentially markets for exploitable people. The treatment room is the supply side of the modern slavery problem. And it arises from the original criminal justice approach that we intended. But it's never been adjusted over time largely because of funding myopia. It becomes a self-perpetuating spiral of we fund what we ask for. So the demand side, which is the vaccination approach, is the only way to end modern slavery. And I want to be very clear. I've said this a few times, Michelle, as you probably remember. Anyone telling the world that they are ending or eliminating modern slavery, but is working on the supply side, they're deluded, right? They're deluded at best, lying at worst. They are changing nothing on the macro level because the treatment room doesn't work on the macro level. It's a micro impact. So at its core, modern slavery is many markets for people who are exploitable by those who benefit from the exploitation to satisfy the demand for their labor. For exploiting others in their workplaces, the exploiter's why is simply that every single day they calculate that it doesn't hurt their business to do so, and maybe even make a profit. They reason, although to be frank, not in such elaborate and clear terms, that there is no business there's no business advantage for them to treat people better. And so they do the minimum, or even worse. Now remember, for a huge percentage of the world's population, and this is going to sound cynical, intrinsic good has nothing at all to do with business. Friedman told the world's private sector to make money at any cost. And so they do just that. And if you look at any bank, if you look at any financial institution, and you look at the vast majority of MBA programs around the world, it's still that to this day. And it remains the prevailing way business gets done. Just ask any of the big four management consultancies, as cynical as that sounds. So the central problem for anyone addressing modern slavery, and in particular forced labor in global value chains, is business people who don't find a place for intrinsic good in their business. And they abuse human rights, or they allow the abuse or overlook the abuse in human rights in their global value chain because it doesn't hurt their business to do so. And in fact, even more cynically, it doesn't provide a return on investment. That behavior is directly driven by consumer demand. We're asking businesses to provide a burgeoning volume of goods and services through their global value chains. They continue to outsource and lose accountability in their chains. And that demand is enabled by all of us who consume. Without knowing the conditions under which they were made, we buy from those businesses and demand more from those businesses. We get what we asked for, in fact. We are getting what we've asked for. We've trusted the private sector to do the right thing. That trust was very, very badly misplaced. Indeed, I mean, if you think about it, it makes no sense that trust was provided to the business world, the private sector in the first place. So this is how I came to create Slave Free Trade. Michelle mentioned I run a global NGO. After years of working on the supply side, only to find, just like with counter narcotics and counter small arms, both of which I've done, only to find that those actions are futile. They have no impact whatsoever. So I thought we needed a systemic response to this systemic problem. We needed to go to the root, the causes, the demand behind it. So the slavers and exploiters I've met over the years are not complete ratbags. Lots of them are just opportunistic, and they're users of people. They're taught to use people. Their parents teach them to use people. The way we raise boys is a big part of it. And like so many of the world's population, that's how business is done. We can actually take a lot of them out of the business of slaving by giving them something more positive to strive for. And some of you, again, will find this a little cynical view, but it cannot be about the intrinsic good. We are not going to win an argument with business asking them to respect the intrinsic good that comes with human rights in workplaces and global value chains. That doesn't appeal to them. I have had in writing from hundreds and hundreds of businesses that human rights are not on their agenda. It still needs to boil down to money. So what we need then is to build a better, healthier, more respectful market to be in. There needs to be value for the business in addressing modern slavery in their value chains. They're always asking, but what is the ROI? What will it cost? Clearly, we need to construct markets that businesses need to want to be part of for their own, let's say, selfish and commercial reasons, because that's where we're going to get people to change their behavior. So that would mean a completely new way of thinking about modern slavery. It means reconceptualizing human rights and workplaces and building a new economic model, even if that sounds idealistic, that advantages your business if you respect human rights. And that's the slave-free trade model. So the central question was, how do we make respecting people pay? What would a market look like in which you can't participate if you're not up for doing good, if the intrinsic good does not become a part of your bottom line? So effectively, this takes turning market forces back on themselves to reinforce good behavior. That takes harnessing what everyone points out to be problematic, like the proliferation and multiplication that occurs in global value chains, turn it back to our advantage. Don't make it a disadvantage anymore. And clearly this is no small task, but ending the pandemic wasn't a small task either. So, and I've said over the last few webinars that the numbers being thrown around, you can only come to the one inescapable conclusion about the real extent of this problem. Millions, hundreds of millions of people are being exploited and abused each day. This is a task, even if it's big, we need to be up for. And we need to explore solutions that operate at the system level. Yeah, to me, the Amnesty International position actually goes back to the drafting of the Trafficking Protocol, where there was this schism. And the schism was between liberal feminism and radical feminism. Radical feminism has resulted in the equalities model, or the Nordic model. Liberal feminism has resulted in Amnesty International's approach. This school of feminism, their approach is principally that women are free to choose to be in prostitution and to sell their bodies, right? So that's the liberal feminist school, otherwise it's also called the lipstick feminist school for various reasons. But Amnesty kind of seems to have sided with one of those sides in the schism leading up to the protocol. The important thing at that point you made about the change in value that comes from it. So there was a sea change in Swedish society when this law was brought out. I mean, things were already starting to shift on violence against women in Sweden. Younger and younger ages of schools were being taught, in particular boys were being taught about violence against girls and violence against women, and it became very, very much a part of the culture as this law came into being that violence against women included all of these different behaviors. And as a Swedish man, I can tell you things have really changed in the last 20 years. It is so outside the culturally accepted precepts of Swedish society amongst men that they can not just buy women, but they don't even ogle women, right? They don't objectify women. They're very careful about how they talk about women and the way women dress and things like this. And it's so unbelievably a social outcast to become a social outcast, to talk about these things in any terms other than that they're dreadful and should be subject to opprobrium. And so that's been reflected, of course, in the statistics around violence against women, which, if you look at them in Sweden, there's been a massive uptick in violence against women in Sweden, if you look at the statistics. But in fact, it's because women and men have become more empowered to report violence against women. So there's been a huge uptick in reports of violence against women, largely attributed to this, I think, this empowerment. Okay. Inge, do you mind if I jump in on this? Is this okay? I don't want to sideline you. It's okay? Okay, good. So one of the things that has not happened yet in global value chains is that we don't understand, it's not been internalized to realize that in workplaces, human rights exist on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is all of these conditions we're talking about with modern slavery. We're talking about human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, and the old style of slavery and servitude. These exist on a spectrum. And so, as with all spectrums, there's another end to it. And if we don't reconceptualize this, or if we do reconceptualize this as being this human rights spectrum in workplaces, one of the really great advantages is that we can forget for now all of these legal definitions and the arguments that go on about these legal definitions. Thanks to this exploitation creep that I mentioned earlier, if you don't any longer need to be able to legally distinguish between forced labor and human trafficking, for example, it makes little to no difference to the victim, after all. My first child labor case was a child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, and slavery and servitude case. 12-year-old boy fitted all 4 definitions, and he still wasn't helped. It didn't matter at all that we sit here and academics argue and politicians argue about these distinctions between these legal forms. So that murky pool of exploitation at the bottom end is characterized by low respect for human rights. 1 or 2 rights extremely eroded, or lots could be eroded. In any case, we know that life down that end of the pool is pretty bad. At the far right of the spectrum is that rather heavenly place we might call decent work. If we could tell that someone is in conditions close to the decent work end of the spectrum, closer than the modern slavery end of the spectrum, you can see quite quickly what we've done. We've proved a culture of respect for human rights in a workplace. In so doing, we have actually disproved that modern slavery exists. Because decent work and modern slavery can't coexist in the same workplace. You can't be at both ends of the same spectrum at the same time. These are not isolated cases. Human rights issues in workplaces like modern slavery are never isolated incidents. So if we identify the culture in a workplace, we've identified the issue, and we can weed out a culture that speaks to labor problems. So when I started my NGO, Slave Free Trade, it really started from that perspective that we could operationalize international human rights law. We could create a model that was agnostic to country, to jurisdiction, to legal definitions, and really just look at that, locating a workplace on this spectrum of human rights. And then, of course, the next question was how do you locate that workplace? So with the way Slave Free Trade we do it, we have what we call core processes, 4 core processes. And the first one is a lesson I learned from that child labor case was that the legal definitions didn't mean anything to him. International law and the framing of it didn't mean anything to him. What really mattered was somebody understanding what his lived life was like in the workplace. And so we have a process we call workforce assessment, which is the first process. This is a process that garners the individual view of people in workplaces about their conditions. Because you think about your workplace, you're the best judge of your conditions. Your employer is not. So workforce assessment. The second process is called policy alignment. So this is where the company gets to have its say. Does it have a policy on this? Does it have a grievance resolution mechanism? What is it? What training does it provide on this, this, and this? This is the corporate view. And the corporate view, just to say, that is what you get in almost every existing scheme. Fair trade, B Corp, Global Reporting Initiative, Dow Jones questionnaire on sustainability. So all the sustainability ratings agencies, they are all based on the company's assessment of their own conditions. Self-assessment, self-reporting. I think you can quite quickly see what the problem with that model is. The third process that all companies have to go through when they join Slave Free Trade is called impact communications, where alongside the workforce questions, we've integrated impact-related questions. So we're trying to understand what impact this is having. Is it improving trust in the workplace? Has employer-employee relations changed, etc.? And the impact on the community. Every workplace is a complex adaptive system inside a complex adaptive system, a community around them. And we need to make sure it's net positive impact that we're having. And the fourth one, and this speaks to the global value chains, the fourth process is, it's a little bit Slave Free Trade's secret sauce. We call it network mapping. And it actually goes back to a very common counter-narcotics investigative technique, which if you want to get to a drug trafficker, for example, you start with it. You don't go straight to try to find the drug trafficker or the importer. You start with a user and find the dealer. You go to that dealer and find the next level dealer. So what you do is you peel it off a layer at a time, because each of those entities only knows the next one in the chain. It's exactly the same in global value chains. A chocolatier in the UK knows its cocoa processor, because that's who they buy their cocoa from. The chocolatier in the UK doesn't know the cocoa plantation where the beans come from. So there's something we have to break down there. And the way we do it is this simple investigative technique. One layer at a time, we peel it off. And at the same time, we have to recognize there is a reason there is this blindness in global value chains, why company A can't see what company C is doing. Because the communication between workplaces in global value chains, between companies in global value chains, is a 2-track conversation, price and quality. They don't care about the conditions in the workplace from the company they're buying from. And even if they could care about it, they're just going to get the company self-reporting and saying, nah, everything's good. Then at the next level, because of commercial secrecy, businesses won't tell their clients who their supplier is in turn. So company A can't find out who company C is, and they certainly can't find out the conditions. So in the process that we've developed, the network mapping process, we keep the commercial secrecy blinkers up. So company A still can't see the identity and location of the plantation, not the precise location. But what they can see, we take the blinkers off for the conditions in the workplace. So we're communicating through the entire value chain, the conditions in each workplace, but maintaining the commercial secrecy. And so the interesting effect that's had, and we've done this, we've already done a cocoa supply chain. So the effect that it's had is that the workplaces in that chain become dependent on the human rights performance of others in the chain, because the chocolate bar can't go on the shelf unless the cocoa processor and the cocoa plantation are all human rights, and the chocolatier are all human rights compliant. So they start to depend on it. So going back to that earlier point that I made about ROI, businesses are always saying, what's the return on investment? Well, the return on investment is quite simply that chocolate bar gains 45% year-on-year sales growth by virtue of being proven slave-free, and everybody in the chain benefits from that 45% year-on-year sales growth. So the ROI is that the bottom line becomes dependent on the human rights performance of all of the companies in the chain. And they start talking about human rights in a way they never have before. So this is the kind of sea change we're looking at. And the way consumers, and I use a broad term for consumers, public procurement agencies, investors, anybody who can make a buying decision that can influence purchasing is a consumer in this model. So a public procurement agency that gets a Ministry of Defense that gets 5 tenders across their table for army boots, 80% likely to have slavery behind those boots. What would a public procurement agency do if one of those companies could suddenly prove that their boots are slave-free or human rights compliant? The public procurement agency, the category manager at the public procurement agency at the Ministry of Defense, they have no choice but to take the slave-free. Because if they don't take the slave-free, it's their ass, right? In 12 months' time, when Parliament asked the question about why they took another one, one that couldn't prove human rights compliance, it's their ass. The public procurement agency needs to do it. And in places like the UK now, public procurement, they're required to include social sustainability and human rights in their evaluation. It's 10% of the evaluation for public bodies in the UK for the evaluation. So there are all sorts of triggers we can pull, and what we're doing at Slave Free Trade is, and you'll see this in August with the world's first guaranteed slave-free cocoa chocolate bars on the shelves in the UK. What we're doing is we're putting our logo on products where the entire value chain is human rights compliant. And so this means that the consumer standing in front of the chocolate bars in the supermarket can actively make a choice. And I can tell you that when you put these products on the shelves and you put one slave-free label on one of the chocolates, people jump on it. It may not be 100% conversion, but it's really close to it. It's a compelling proposition for a consumer. In the same way the public procurement agent can't make a difference, can't buy against the idea of human rights compliance. It's the same with the shopper. There's a strong emotional resonance, which means they suddenly, seeing slave-free on a product, the consumer starts to feel like the hero in the story. They start to get power from the simple act of purchasing. And that micro behavior is what we're trying to trigger and then scale it. So that micro behavior multiplied millions of times, that's global social change right there. So this is what we can do about labor exploitation in supply chains, global value chains.
Oh, thank you very much, Brian. It's very good that you finish with this very concrete example, which could be obviously imitated in many other countries. And this slave-free label is powerful and is a good motivation for many people.